This is the Dallas Morning News.
I'm Talmage Boston, and welcome to this edition of Cross-Examining History, where we explore America's fascinating past with our country's leading historians and thought leaders. For this podcast, I interviewed Matthew Pinsker, discussing his new book, Boss Lincoln, The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln, that was released on February 10, 2026, and we did the program in front of a live audience in Dallas on June the 2nd, 2026. Enjoy. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. We're so glad everybody's here. Most of you, at least, have gotten your books signed. Those that have not, Matt will be here afterwards to sign any that are left unsigned. My name's Talmage Boston. I'm with the Shackelford Law Firm. Glad all of you are here. With no further ado, let's get on with this important program. Most of you already have your books. This is the big Lincoln book of the year. Got a big 2-page review in the Wall Street Journal. Matt Pinsker, who told us last night it only took him 13 years to research and write this book, which he said this book is ready to have its bar mitzvah. But Matt, undergrad at Harvard, graduate work at Oxford, and a professor at Dickinson College, and has a initiative called the House Divided Initiative that in this polarized country we're living in, we need more people making us think about the consequences of where we are politically. So without further ado, please welcome Matt Pinsker.
Thank you. Now, before we get started, okay, can I just say something? So I'm a Sixers fan, so I'm rooting for the Spurs, all right? But I do feel like I was worried coming here. I thought it was a hostile climate because I'm a Steelers fan, too. I know. And then I went to Harvard, and I'm meeting all these Princeton graduates in the room today. But Talmage has been a good friend, and I'm grateful to be here. So thank you for having me.
All right, so let's talk about Abraham Lincoln. I like to start with the epigraph, which in your case was Lincoln's 1852 quote that was part of the eulogy to Henry Clay on the necessity of a politician's being connected to a political party. So read aloud your epigraph.
I could do it by memory, but I don't want to botch it, so. A free people in times of peace and quiet, when pressed by no common danger, naturally divide into parties. At such times, the man who is of neither party is not and cannot be of any consequence. So the point I always make is that Lincoln says that you can't be a man of consequence unless you're a partisan. And that's something that jars some people when they think about it, because we use that word like an insult. But for Lincoln, it was a compliment because it meant you were engaged in the work of democracy. And that's what the book's about.
Yes, on the one hand, he had the commitment to political parties, although he went from party to party, from Whigs to Republicans, and ultimately to the National Union Party until his death in 1865. So, on the other hand, yes, he's committed to parties, but your book details how he was, in many senses, a party abandoner who was fine with switching horses and leaving his party behind when he thought it was no longer capable of meeting his political goals. So give us your perspective on, yes, committed to parties, but not afraid to leave parties behind.
Yeah, in the book, I argue that everybody knows Lincoln was a politician. That's not news, okay? But in the book, I argue that his ambition wasn't what you expect from a politician. It wasn't just to win office. From the beginning of his career, he saw himself as a party leader. Like, his ambition was to build organizations that could make real change. And so he built and led the Whig Party in Illinois, but when the National Whig Party was kind of struggling, they were always fighting uphill. They were a minority party. And when he couldn't break through, he didn't abandon them. This is like a glass half full, glass half empty motion. But he tried to expand them and reorganize them. And that's what became the anti-slavery. The word they used was fusion, the coalition that became the Republican Party. And then he's the leader and builder of the Republican Party, not just in Illinois, but across the country. People don't realize how prominent he was in the 1850s. He wasn't just a lawyer in Springfield. He was a major party boss in one of the key swing states in American politics. And then the last point Talmage made, which I think, to me, it's one of the most important contributions of the book, which is that Lincoln argues and leads a movement to create a Union Party during the Civil War. And we don't remember that anymore. We just think of him as a Republican. But I do believe that in his theory of the war, you could not save the Union without first building a Union Party. You needed the Union Army and Navy for sure. You have to win the war, but you also have to win the home front. And that was just as much a struggle as anything else. And how he did it is what the book is largely about.
Mm-hmm. Now, your introduction tells the story of a stagecoach ride in the summer of 1847. The coach is leaving Chicago, headed towards Springfield. It's left behind a political convention about promoting internal improvements on rivers and harbors. And on the stagecoach are Lincoln, a Whig, a congressman from Illinois, Democrat named Robert Smith, and a reporter for the Boston Courier newspaper, Joseph Buckingham. So what happened on that stagecoach ride that sets up the theme of your book?
So throughout the book, I only use contemporary documents. It's letters, diaries, newspaper coverage. I don't use recollected accounts, especially not for quotes. You know, it's all contemporary, like real time. And to me, this is one of the best real-time moments. There's this reporter who's traveling after this big convention. You never heard of it, right? The Chicago River and Harbor Convention. But they said it was the biggest grassroots convention of the early 19th century. And they were lobbying. I know this sounds ridiculous. Although people here are, you know, professionals, you might appreciate this. They're lobbying for better dredging of rivers and harbors, you know, and they're angry and motivated about it. And Lincoln was a big supporter of it. That's internal improvements. And so he's riding home trying to win over this Democratic congressman to support, you know, river and harbor improvements, because the Democrats were kind of opposed to it and the Whigs were kind of supportive of it. But Smith was willing to cross party lines. And this reporter from Boston doesn't know either of them, right? But he's sitting there in the carriage and he's amazed at how he says it's a carriage built for four, and they're carrying 6 people, and one of these politicians is long-legged. That's how he describes 6'4" Abraham Lincoln. So you can imagine how crowded it is. And it took them, you know, almost 18 hours to ride this carriage down from, they rode from Peoria to Springfield, and it's dusty. And the reporter from Boston is complaining, but he says Lincoln never stopped with his banter. And he's even, when they get to stops, he's not just chatting up the passengers in the carriage, he's greeting all the farmers and their horses and their cattle, he says. And he's making fun of Lincoln. He doesn't even name him, right? He just says the Whig congressman. And I thought it was just this amazing snapshot of how Lincoln was a networker. And you don't think of him that way, but it's an important part of his rise. He's on the way up here, and he's trying to build. And, I mean, that's what you're doing here in this room. And that's what he was doing in the carriage. It humanized him.
You said he's trying to build a coalition with a Democrat.
Right.
During the ride. So
yeah, and I don't know
nobody was safe from his coalition building.
I don't know if you remember this, but there's a lot of depth in these stories. But when Lincoln was greeting the horses and the cattle and the swine, according to the Boston Reporter, who's mocking him, he was doing it in a part of his congressional district where he had been in trouble, like politically, because, and I think some people appreciate this, he was being attacked by some of his neighbors for not being Christian enough, because he wasn't a church member. And so there was some tension over religion. I know you had Richard here last year. He probably talked about this. Lincoln's Christianity was complicated. And then he was also being accused of some of his neighbors of getting too highfalutin. So, he had married into a richer family, and he was this lawyer, lobbyist, and some of his farmer neighbors thought he'd, gotten heirs. And so he was trying to placate them, and it's just part of his story.
Now, you mentioned that the partisan strategies of Lincoln revolved around two competing impulses. One, ultraism, which basically means extremism, i.e. the base, and fusionism, which means attempting to bring people together. So for most of his political career, Lincoln was a fusionist, although in 1864, he really became an ultraist. So talk about why he made the shift.
Yeah, no, I think Talmage just betrayed his political leanings there. The way you described ultraism and fusionism, you stacked the deck a little bit there. So ultraism isn't extremism. It's more like focusing on intensity, inner facing, mobilizing your core supporters. So like the way Trump handles MAGA, that's ultraism, right? You're mobilizing your base. You're not worrying about placating Democrats or independents, okay? And so Lincoln, as a Whig, was a fusionist because he said, our base isn't big enough. We've got to expand. That's what Rivers and Harbors was about. Then he becomes a Republican. He's still a fusionist at first. He's trying to form a fusion of anti-slavery Democrats and anti-slavery Whigs. That's what the Republican Party is. But then, even before 1864, he becomes an ultra-Republican because he says, we can't just include anybody in this Republican Party. The bright line, and I don't call it extremism, but the bright line of principle that made somebody Republican, according to Lincoln, was they had to say that slavery was wrong, okay? Anti-slavery. Not that we're going to abolish it in the states where it exists because the Constitution doesn't allow that, but we just have to acknowledge that it's wrong and that we're going to work toward policies that will turn the country toward freedom. That's what he meant by that famous House divided speech, okay? Now, you think to yourself, well, what's controversial about that? Well, in the book, and this is something that we talk about in history classes, but people tend to forget. In the book, Lincoln's leading rival was Stephen Douglas, the Democratic senator from Illinois. But Douglas got into a feud with the Democratic Party and its leaders over what their policy on slavery should be. And you might remember from your school days, and I don't want to play professor, right? But Douglas's policy was popular sovereignty. Let the people in the Western territories decide for themselves. And Lincoln said that's not good enough to make him a Republican. The Democrats didn't like that. They wanted a pro-slavery policy, at least the Democrats in states like Texas, okay? And so Douglas's popular sovereignty policy got him into a feud with Southern Democrats and the Democratic president, James Buchanan, who went to Dickinson College, where I teach.
Not exactly something you're proud of.
Yeah, right.
Since he's regarded as the worst president in the history of America.
James Buchanan and Chief Justice Roger Taney, the author of the Dred Scott decision.
The most disgraced U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice.
They both went to Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
We are so glad you're there. They obviously need some help.
Right. So the story is that Douglas gets kind of pushed out of the Democratic Party. And Republican leaders wanted to make him a Republican. And Lincoln says no. Not just because he and Douglas were rivals, but because he says Douglas's popular sovereignty does not draw the line on slavery. It doesn't say slavery is wrong. It just says let the people decide. It's like any other issue. And Lincoln says Democratic politics is about compromise, but it's also about principle. And we have to draw the line here and say slavery is wrong. And nobody who isn't willing to say that can become a Republican. And that's how he became a Republican ultra. And I don't think that was extreme, but it was important. And then as a Union leader during the Civil War, he figures out a way to alternate between the two, fusion and ultraism, you know? And the ultraism in the Civil War is he becomes a supporter of emancipation and abolition. And the fusionism is, he says, let's get Democrats and conservatives to join us, Republicans. We'll call ourselves Unionists, and we'll all do it, not for the sake of the principle, but for the sake of saving democracy and the Union. And that's what made the Union Party a little different than the Republican Party.
Okay, in defense of myself, I'm curious if anyone in this room had ever heard the word ultraism before this morning.
Yeah.
Because when I read the book, I said, what does that word mean?
Right.
And the dictionary definition was extremism.
Yeah.
So we needed Matt here to tweak the dictionary definition. Thank you, Matt.
My kids call me Matt GPT, right? You know? Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about Lincoln's political evolution as a Whig. In 1840, with William Henry Harrison, 1844 with Henry Clay, and 1848 with Zachary Taylor, Lincoln bet on the right Whig horse for the Republican nomination for president. And then, of course, William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor were both elected president, although they both had short terms. So take them one at a time. What was it about each of those three Whigs that Lincoln wanted to support?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because the 1840 election, William Henry Harrison wins. That's the first time a Whig becomes president. And, for me, what's most interesting about it is that's how Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd fell in love. Because she was this young woman from Kentucky who had moved to Springfield to live with her sister, and she's highly political. Her father was Henry Clay's friend in Kentucky, and she was interested in the campaign.
And she's also looking for a husband, and that's why she moved to Springfield.
Yeah, I was going to provoke you to say that. Talmage and I have been arguing over the nature of their marriage. No, neither one of us were there. We don't know, okay? But I argue that their marriage was better than people realize because they were both political, and they fell in love during the 1840 presidential election. And in 1844, Lincoln supports Clay. Clay is like the great founder and leader of the Whig Party, but they lose. And they lose because they lose the key electoral state, the biggest electoral college state of New York, because there was an abolitionist party, a third party supporting the abolition of slavery called the Liberty Party. And they drained just enough votes away from the Whigs in New York to throw the election to the Democrats. And from then on, Lincoln is obsessed by trying to figure out how to navigate the slavery issue to build a majority party. That's why he becomes a Republican eventually. But the real election, to me, that tells you what you need to know about Lincoln as a Whig was that election in 1848 when he supports Zachary Taylor over Henry Clay for the Whig nomination.
His hero,
because what it shows you is for him, parties are not cults of personalities. He's not supporting a man. He's supporting a combination of what they called then men and measures, but he's doing it for a larger principle and strategy. And he decided that Zachary Taylor was the kind of popular former military hero that the Whigs needed to win. And they were going to diminish the partisan policy issues and just try to promote patriotism. And it worked. Although, as you said, Taylor died shortly after taking office, and he didn't have a very successful presidency. Lincoln was kind of disappointed by the nature of the compromise of 1850.
He was succeeded by the very famous President Millard Fillmore.
Yeah. And Lincoln was disappointed in Fillmore. That was where things started to unravel for him as a Whig. And then Henry Clay dies in 1852. And that quote that Talmage had me read, that was from Lincoln's eulogy on Clay. And the key point in that eulogy, Lincoln says a man of consequence has to be a man of party, okay? But in the eulogy on the great founder of the Whig Party, Lincoln never mentions the word Whig once. He doesn't talk about Clay as a Whig. He talks about Clay instead as somebody who came to oppose slavery, even though he had been a slaveholder. And so you could see in his head, he's already thinking to himself, we need a new party. And we need to have a fusion of anti-slavery forces. And that's where Talmage and I were talking about whether he's abandoning the Whigs or he's building a new movement, glass half empty, half full. That's the moment that he captured with that epigraph.
So between 1850, helping Zachary Taylor get elected, and then until 1854, he's mainly a lawyer. He's not actively involved in politics, but nonetheless, we all know historically, he's always involved in politics. He's just not running for office. So talk about during those years when he's kind of away from the political arena, what's he doing as a fusionist to try to maintain this effort to bring anti-slavery parties together.
So I imagine in a room like this, you'll completely appreciate and understand what I'm about to say. But he's not just a lawyer, like the lawyer of lore, circuit riding attorney, telling folk tales at the courthouse steps. During this period of time, he's making most of his money as a lobbyist. Okay, he's a lawyer lobbyist working for the railroad companies. This is the biggest period of railroad development in the country. He's the highest paid railroad attorney in Illinois, and he's powerful. He's at the intersection of law and politics, okay? And this is how I demonstrate it to people. And tell me if anybody here has heard this story. There's a couple people here from Illinois originally, but the first town that was ever named after Abraham Lincoln in America was named after him in 1853, Lincoln, Illinois. That's 5 years before the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's, 8 years before he gets into the White House.
Yeah.
It's 10 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. And the town is named after him in recognition of his authority and accomplishments as a lobbyist for the railroad company. Lincoln, Illinois. And so it just shows you how important he was, even though he wasn't in elected office.
Mm-hmm. Now then, in 1854, things change. He becomes thunderstruck, his word, by the Kansas-Nebraska Act led by Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois, which nullified the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And Lincoln thought the new law was, quote, illegitimate and conceived in violence. So he moved forward and ultimately ran for Senate under which party's banner? This is the period when he's deciding, I've got to do something different. The Whigs aren't going to make it big time.
So the question of which party it was is something that divides historians. Like if you bring different people here, they would tell you he's not yet a Republican. But in the book, I argue that what he was doing was the Republican strategy. Sometimes they called themselves anti-Nebraska. Sometimes they called themselves the People's Party. Sometimes they called themselves the Anti-Slavery Party. But they started calling themselves more frequently the Republican Party. And the whole book is based on Lincoln's private notes and notebooks and letters. In his private notebooks during the fall and winter of 1854 and 55, he starts referring to the growing fusion of the anti-slavery forces as the Republican organization. In public, he doesn't say that, but in private, he does. And so the argument I make is he's a Republican. He's just careful about how they message that fact because it's controversial. Moving from one party to the other is difficult. This is how you manage it. The point of the book is showing how he manages difficult things behind the scenes. And I think this is one of the best examples.
Mm-hmm. Now, in 1858, as he runs against Stephen Douglas, the campaign is highlighted by the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. There's 7 of them, 7 different towns in Illinois. So how strong was the Republican Party during 1858? He's their nominee, but what kind of a platform is that for him to stand on, this basically brand new party?
So, it's a good question. First of all, Lincoln's the nominee of the party because of the feud with Douglas and the Democrats. Remember, we talked about that a minute ago. Stephen Douglas and the National Democrats are feuding over his popular sovereignty policy. And the Republicans are thinking about, the Republicans from the East, like New York and D.C., are thinking about bringing Douglas into the party. And Lincoln stops it. And he gets the nomination of the Illinois Republican Party for the U.S. Senate against Douglas in order to stop it. And the reason why that's like such a big development, unprecedented in American political history, is because, I don't know if you remember this, but back then people didn't vote for U.S. Senator. It was before the 17th Amendment. So the legislators selected the senators. So there's no need to nominate anybody. But they did it to stave off the talk of making Douglas a Republican. So they made it clear that the Illinois Republicans were going rogue and they weren't listening to the Eastern Party leaders and they were going to nominate Lincoln to run against Douglas. That's why we have the debates. Mm-hmm. And how strong is that party? Well, it's strong enough that they won the popular vote in Illinois in 1858. And the only reason Lincoln didn't become a senator is because of holdover seats and a redistricting. They had redistricting and gerrymandering back then, and the Democrats were able to control the legislature even though they didn't have a majority of the popular vote, and that's the only reason Douglas got reelected.
So Lincoln loses to Douglas in the election of 1858, but he doesn't stop his political bent. As soon as that election's over, what's he doing to further his political ambitions?
Right, so I want you to think about what Talmage just said, right? Lincoln loses the election, but Lincoln doesn't think he loses, okay? When Lincoln runs for president 2 years later, in 1860, he writes an autobiographical sketch for a newspaper in Pennsylvania that's doing a series of profiles on potential Republican nominees. And Lincoln says, the only time I have been beaten by the people was in 1832 when he was 23 and he ran for his first office as a candidate for the state legislature in Illinois, okay? It's the only time he says I've been beaten by the people. But I bet everybody in this room has heard all the stories about how Lincoln suffered all these defeats and setbacks and disappointments. That's not how he saw his career. He saw his career as one success after another. That defeat by Douglas in 1858 wasn't a personal defeat. They won the popular vote. It was a party defeat because they didn't control the legislature, but they should have. And so he immediately sees, after the 1858 election, that the Republican Party is on its way to power. And they just have to figure out how to organize the final details to win the key states that they need to take control of the Electoral College. And that is literally exactly what they do in the next 2 years. And it's under his leadership that they make that happen. This is how he gets to be president. It's not like he's this obscure, humble prairie lawyer from Springfield who just gets vaulted into national power. It takes work. Now, you know, you're people of business and affairs. You know that. But when you read about it in school, it doesn't always come across. And I feel like that's something we have to emphasize to people and to students.
I think it's pretty safe to assume that as of 1858, he is running for president. He makes sure that the Lincoln-Douglas debates get published, and not only are they published, but they're circulated nationally, and that serves as the basis after he loses, that he's invited to New York City in February 1860 to give his speech, the Cooper Union speech, which most historians call, quote, the speech that made him president. It electrified the audience. So what was it about that speech that was such a turning point toward getting the Republican nomination for president in 1860?
Okay, so Talmage and I like to spar on some of these issues. So the way he put it, you know, Talmage, that's not the way I like to put it. Now,
I know, that's why I put it my way. I didn't want to put it your way.
He did this to me last night, too, and I got all agitated.
Makes for a more interesting interview.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way Talmage just put it was, Lincoln's running for president, okay? In the book, the way I put it was, he's not running for president. He's running for leadership of the Republican Party. Remember Boss Lincoln. His goal is not office first. His goal is to create and build a party that will achieve national power. Now, if that means he's the candidate for president, he's willing to do it. If that means somebody else has to be the candidate for president, he's willing to do it. And in the book, I show a dozen examples where sometimes he puts himself forward and sometimes he puts someone else forward. He's like a chess master, okay? And so from 58 to 60, he's mostly just building the party. He's working behind the scenes, writing letters to people he doesn't know, trying to organize the National Republican Party. But then right on the eve of the convention, it's clear that he's going to be the best choice for president. And that's when, in early 1860, he organizes the effort to make him president. They get the convention selected for Chicago. That wasn't an accident. That's when he knows that he's going to be a leading contender. And they do all the things necessary to make it happen. That was at the same time he's given the speaking tour in the East. You know, the speech that made Lincoln president. I don't think any speech made Lincoln president, but these speeches in New York and New England, they help establish Lincoln as, the word they used then that people don't use anymore, but several newspapers described him this way. They call him a representative man. And that word that phrase doesn't sound like much to us, but what that meant to them was boss, leader, right? He's not, you probably have heard this. He's described sometimes today as the most available candidate. His availability, was what made him president. But that's not what made Lincoln president, right? He didn't position himself as a blank slate, like a popular celebrity or like a military hero like Zachary Taylor or William Henry Harrison, or the first Republican candidate for president, John Fremont. He positioned himself as a very active, engaged Republican Party leader who knew how to manage their factions and disagreements and keep them unified. That's what Representative Mann meant. And that was why he got chosen as the Republican nominee.
Okay, our conversation's about to get very interesting.
Okay.
Because a few minutes ago, you recall, Matt talked about he and I have very different perceptions of the Lincoln marriage.
Right.
And famously, Mary Todd Lincoln, who was very high-strung and did all kinds of strange things, but early on as a teenager decided her life's ambition was to marry the man who would become president. And sure enough, when she met Abe Lincoln in Springfield in 1840, she was the first one who said, I think this guy can be president. I think I'm interested in marrying this guy because I think he can be president. Nobody else. Here's this ugly, poorly clothed, high-pitched voice, socially awkward as far as, dancing and stuff like that. But they get married. I mean, you left out the part they split up. He nearly had a nervous breakdown, and he reluctantly went back and married her because it was such a dishonor to his character.
You see how worked up he gets.
But I'm coming back to the point that in 1858 to 1860, I don't think Mary Todd is saying, come on, Abe, become the head of the Republican Party. She's saying, come on, Abe, you can be president. Don't you think?
Don't I think? Yeah, I don't think.
We can agree to disagree.
All right, so, half of what Talmage said there is a little bit of folklore after the war, not from contemporary documents, so I dispute some of that. But I'll give you one example of a contemporary document that I think proves my point. When Lincoln, after their breakup, right, when Lincoln is back on the courting path, trying to win her over, this is Abraham Lincoln trying to win over Mary Todd. He sends her a chart that shows how he became the leading vote getter for the Whig Party's candidates for the legislature from his first defeat in 1832 that I mentioned to the time when he becomes the Whig floor leader. And so the point was, like, I'm a man on the rise, kind of thing. And that was a courting document that he sent her. She accepted it as a gift. This is how political they were. But then when Talmage says, she's not going to encourage him to be the leader of the Republican Party, this is where I ask you, like, is Abraham Lincoln really going to be, dictated to by his wife over his decisions as a partisan leader? And I dedicated my book to Boss Rachel, my wife, but I don't think Lincoln would call her Boss Mary, okay? Like, he was his own man, and he really made the key political decisions. They began to have political disagreements during this period of time. And she kind of, was forced to watch as he became a Republican and then, migrated. She was kind of reluctant to join that Republican movement. He was aggressive about joining it. So they were both stubborn, strong-willed, intelligent political people. They sometimes disagreed, but he certainly wasn't kowtowed by her ambition.
I didn't say it was kowtowed. I said, what was her voice saying?
Yeah, okay.
Okay?
Well, so, you know what? In the spirit of House Divided, we're just going to agree to disagree.
There we go.
Yeah.
That's good. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
So the Democratic Party ruptures in 1860, which allows Lincoln to get elected president, the Republican nominee for president. And soon thereafter, 7 states secede from the Union before his inauguration in March of 1861. So when that happened, how did President-elect Lincoln respond to this secession?
So behind the scenes, he's telling the Republicans, don't compromise. Okay, we have to draw the line here. We're not going to win the election and then give in to this kind of hostage-taking or blackmail. He said, be firm. He says, the tug has to come, he writes in private and confidential letters, better now than any time hereafter. We're going to fight it out on this line, okay? And then when he gets to Washington and gives his inaugural address, the key thing here is his pitch to the nation is that we have a serious disagreement over slavery, obviously. But the way to resolve it is with ballots, not bullets. It's if you don't like what the Republican Party stands for, the anti-slavery party, then you need to go organize and beat us in the next set of elections. You're not going to leave the country. That's the essence of anarchy, he says. You're going to stay in the country and commit yourselves to winning over a majority and taking power and changing policy. That's the Democratic creed. I tell my students that's what Lincoln means by union, okay? The Southerners who seceded, they said the union was a compact of states. If states aren't happy, they can leave. The general Northern view is that the union is like an abstract for the nation, like we the people, okay? But Lincoln's a very precise guy. And his union is the union between the winning party in an election and the losing party in an election. This is Lincoln's greatness as a partisan. Okay, he's tough, he organizes Republicans, but in his inaugural address, he reaches out to Southern Democrats and he says, look, you're my voters too, okay? It's a two-level game in partisan democracy. It's going to be rough and people are going to be angry at each other, but then once you win power, your responsibility is to protect the constitutional rights of the people you defeated and give them time to reorganize and challenge you again in the next election. Now, you know why I'm emphasizing this, because we're in the middle of a crisis of democracy where people are arguing over elections after they happen. And we have to get past that. And that's part of the reason why, I think Talmage brought me here. It's the message I want to give to you. I hope I'm preaching to the choir here, but there are people out there who are beginning to lose faith. And, we have to spread the good news. If you read this book and you admire Lincoln, you've got to go out and convince people that we just have to keep arguing with ballots and not bullets. We just have to commit to that, and we'll get through it.
One of the most famous aspects of Lincoln's presidency was his cabinet. Doris Kearns Goodwin book, Team of Rivals, won the Pulitzer. And the rivals, 3 men who he had beaten to get the Republican nomination for president. But he also chose 3 former Whigs and 4 former Democrats in an attempt to have fusion in his cabinet. And he also achieved a regional balance by picking people who were outside of the 3 big states, New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. So talk about Lincoln's relationship at the very beginning with these cabinet members who he chose, who he really didn't know very well.
Right. Lincoln is a master strategist, but all presidents in that era kind of worked in this formula, which is they had a cabinet composed of different party leaders, different states. They thought about it in very kind of practical terms. By the way, none of it had anything to do with expertise in the field. So the Secretary of War that they appointed, Simon Cameron from Pennsylvania, he was just a corrupt party boss from Pennsylvania. He had no military experience. He wasn't really the best suited for the job, but it was about party management, not about expertise in the field. And so Lincoln is trying to manage coalitions, and it was tough, and he struggled with it. But over the next 4 years, that was where he succeeded. That's what made him great.
Well, and in talking about that over the next 4 years, you talk in the book about how he had such supreme self-confidence and had self-confident command. So all these guys had a lot more national political experience than he did. And yet from day one, he knows, I'm not going to say this, but I am the smartest guy in the room. I'm going to be the decision maker. And none of these guys who've been around a lot longer than I have are going to cause me to have any less influence. Talk about that self-confidence from day one from a guy who had been in Washington for 1 2-year term before he's president of the United States.
Right, here's my point, okay? He had served 1 term in Congress, but his experience wasn't as an office holder. It was as a party leader. And that's where he knew he was better and smarter than these cabinet officers who thought of themselves first and not the organization. So his experience as a Whig party leader and then a Republican party leader gave him the mindset that you needed to hold the Union together. Remember, half the battle during the Civil War wasn't just defeating the Confederates, it was keeping the Union together. And that's coalition building and coalition maintenance. And that's what a party leader knows. And that's what Lincoln knew. Better than the cabinet officers who were, undermining him or complaining about things or fighting with each other. And he never quite formed a team of those rivals, in my opinion. They were kind of bickering from beginning to end. But he did lead a coalition that became the Union coalition that won the war.
Yeah, in terms of the divisiveness within his cabinet, I think that's a great point. They, regardless of Doris's title, team of rivals, they were divided. This in particular, he gives his inaugural address, and later that day, the federal troops stationed at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, are running out of supplies, and secessionists are blocking the ships, are trying to restock provisions there. So what was the difference in strategy within the cabinet for how to respond to the crisis at Fort Sumter?
I mean, look, at a moment of war, a lot of people start to flip-flop around. And some of his cabinet were very concerned about escalating into crisis. But Lincoln is convinced they have to draw the line. They get military advice from, Winfield Scott, who's the general-in-chief, saying we should abandon positions and try to compromise. And Lincoln rallies his cabinet around a hard line. Now, it's what provokes the Confederates to fire on Sumter. It starts the war. But it's, again, an evidence of Lincoln's toughness in a moment of crisis where he's ignoring advice from people who are supposedly more experienced than him.
Talking about his toughness in a moment of crisis, in July 1861, so he's only been president 3 or 4 months, there's a threat that Southern militia are about to seize Washington, D.C., and so in response, Lincoln suspends the right to the writ of habeas corpus and has some Maryland legislators arrested so that they won't vote to secede from the Union. They're a border state. So we're talking about a serious denial of constitutional civil rights, and yet in his toughness, he does what he has to do to avoid losing the war at the very beginning. So do you have any criticism, Matt, about Lincoln's approach to doing what it took not to lose the war?
So the Constitution says in time of rebellion or invasion, you can suspend the writ of habeas corpus. You can have preventative arrests, okay? Lincoln says it's rebellion. The Constitution authorizes it, but that's Article 1 of the Constitution. So there are a lot of lawyers in this room. Article 1 is the congressional article. And so Roger Taney, the Dickinson College graduate, is the Chief Justice. He issues an injunction stopping Lincoln from suspending the writ on his own. Congress was out of session. Back then, Congress wasn't as diligent and hardworking as they are now. They were only in session for a few months a year. And so Lincoln's doing this on his own because they're not there. And Taney issues an injunction as a circuit judge sitting in circuit saying, you got to stop this. You can't do it. And Lincoln basically ignores him, takes it to Congress and says, you decide what to do. And in typical congressional fashion, they did decide. It took them 2 years, and then they endorsed what Lincoln did. But, if he had waited for their endorsement, I think the Union would have fallen. So, yes, it was a tough decision. Yes, it's controversial. Democrats at the time in the North hated it. But I think it was necessary. It wasn't always right. There were people who were arrested for bad reasons, but it was ultimately an essential element of the success of the.
Another very tough decision he did was in Missouri. Once the war started, John Fremont was in charge of the Union effort in the West, and he imposed martial law and emancipated all the slaves in Missouri. He did this unilaterally. And when Lincoln learns of it, he revokes his order. So we think of Lincoln as the great emancipator, and here he is revoking an order of emancipation. And he did it because he thought, my gosh, if this happens, we're going to lose all the border states. And then we really will lose the war. So when Lincoln is making this decision, how's his cabinet responding?
Yeah, they're torn. I mean, there are members of the cabinet who are strong abolitionists. They believe in ending slavery, with whatever pretext you can do it. And there are others who are conservatives who think that, if you move too fast on the slavery issue, you'll lose the border states and lose the war. And they argue over this endlessly. And the way Lincoln navigated it was controversial. But ultimately, obviously, I know the answer. It was successful. And so you didn't see it if you lived through it. But from our position, we can learn a lot from it. These things are always controversial, these kinds of decisions. When you're arguing within your own party, it's always about Do you move faster or slower? And that's a tough balancing act. And you have to give leaders some latitude when they're trying to make those decisions, because they're bringing together people who disagree.
So with all this controversy going on, Lincoln, and meanwhile, the Union Army is losing virtually every battle, every major battle. And whereas originally he's tried to get the North together and people to volunteer in the Army, we've got to reunite the country, he comes up with a new strategy, Emancipation Proclamation, a year after he's voted against emancipation in Missouri. So talk about that decision and how his cabinet responded to the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, there's one good snapshot that captures a lot of this. If you remember the book Team of Rivals on the cover, it shows Lincoln reading the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet, and that's the Team of Rivals, right? But he begins that meeting, this is Boss Lincoln. He begins that meeting by telling them, look, I've made this decision, I don't need your advice, okay? And so that's Boss Lincoln, right?
I just want you to know what's going on.
Right, but here's where historians can disagree or agree to disagree. So Lincoln says, I've made my decision, I don't need your advice. But of course, these guys are strong-willed too. They know what they're doing. They give him advice anyway. And he takes one of their counsels, which is William Seward, his old rival, tells him, you should hold this announcement of the proclamation until we win on the battlefield. And so that's why, even though he wrote the draft in July, they don't reveal it until September of 1862, after they win in Antietam at Maryland.
Right, which sets up the issuance public of the Emancipation Proclamation, becomes effective January 1, 1863. In the meantime, the Southerners, for the most part, continue to win most of the major battles, but it all leads to Gettysburg, where the Union Army finally prevents Lee's aggression into the North, and Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address.
Now, hold on. I don't want to get into fights, but we're here in Texas, okay? So this story about the Union Army losing, that's only half the story. That's mostly in the story between Washington and Richmond. There's a general named Grant, and he's doing an awful lot of good things on the Mississippi River. They captured New Orleans in 62. They've imposed this blockade. They're splitting the Confederacy too. They're basically cutting Texas off by controlling the Mississippi. Vicksburg's going to fall at the same time the Union wins, and that's going to secure the division of the Confederacy. So the Union is winning out west and losing in the east before Gettysburg. That's the more complete way to.
Although
that's
if we
the
were
more
to
complete
argue,
way to say.
Which was more important, winning in the east or winning in the west? I think most people would say winning in the east.
Sitting here in Dallas, I think I want to give my deference to the Western Theater.
Okay, but back to the question: the importance of the Gettysburg Address.
Right.
Was this the turning point in the war?
Okay, well, let me begin by saying this. It's the fall of 63, and they're thinking about the next presidential election. And this is an example of Lincoln dealing with dissension within his cabinet, because his Secretary of Treasury, Salmon Chase, a leading radical, he was running against Lincoln for the Union nomination, openly. And so, the president doesn't fire his cabinet officer for being disloyal. His attitude is, we're all looking to create the same goal, so you have every right to lobby people on my behalf. But Lincoln's not just magnanimous. He's also trying to isolate things. But this is how intense it gets, okay? Tell me if anybody's heard this story. So Lincoln goes to Gettysburg to deliver the address. Half the cabinet goes with him. Some of them stay home. Chase, the guy running against him, doesn't go. So the reporters go and they ask Chase, why aren't you going to Gettysburg with the president to give, your gratitude to the fallen soldiers? And Chase, makes excuses. His daughter had just gotten married. He was a widower. He was tired. He had work to do. But one of his aides tells one of the reporters, and this gets reprinted in newspapers all across the North, he mocks the president and the conservative members of the cabinet. And this is how he puts it. He says, let the dead bury the dead. Let the dead bury the dead. Now, that's not Jefferson Davis. That's not Robert E. Lee. That's a cabinet subsecretary. That's the treasurer of the United States, the guy who actually signed the greenbacks. openly mocking the president, and Lincoln doesn't fire him either. Why not? Not because he's weak, but because he's so confident and so strong that he knows he can endure a few slings and arrows from underlings because he still needs those guys as part of the coalition. And within a few weeks, he maneuvers enough support to make Chase's candidacy seem like an aborted effort. And Chase drops out of the race, and Lincoln wins the Union nomination clear. And it demonstrated the wisdom of his, kind of quiet confidence.
So let's talk between the time of the Gettysburg Address, November 1863, and the election, November 1864. We talked before, but let's go into depth on his decision to form, quote, essentially a new party, the Unionists, the National Union's Party. The idea of maintaining, calling himself a Republican goes away. What's behind that decision, and why does it become the successful way to go? Because he does get reelected in November 1864.
Yeah, as early as the summer of 1862, Republican parties across the North begin renaming themselves Union parties. Lincoln stops using the term Republican in public after 1863. They only talk about themselves as Unionists. They are calling themselves Unionists from 1862 forward. Now, there are a few exceptions here and there, but, that's a story most people have forgotten. It wasn't just, like a marketing change, like a shift in name or label in 1864. It's this long movement that takes 2 or 3 years to really culminate. But the keystone to this is they're trying to win over some Northern Democrats who support the war and some border state conservatives. And the best example of how that played out is that he dumps his first vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, from the ticket and replaces him with a Democrat who supports the war from the South, who also, by that point, supports the abolition of slavery, and that's Andrew Johnson from Tennessee. And this is, how you get the Lincoln-Johnson ticket in 1864.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your book's final 2 sentences, you say, quote, Lincoln's achievements materialized from his relentless devotion to pursuing ever more perfect unions, and that is a lesson for every generation of citizens and partisans, close quote. So isn't that the key trait in a democracy that it must have in order to have a government that functions?
Right. Partisanship should not be an insult. In a democracy like this, we think of it as an insult because we only focus on one dimension of it, which is attacking your enemy. But the other dimension where Lincoln excelled was in organizing your friends. And it doesn't even matter if you're in politics, right? In any organization, any business leader, you have to organize people with different views. And it's hard, but it's an essential trait to success, and Lincoln had it. And then the last thing, as far as we're concerned as citizens, is this is a 2-level game in a democracy. You organize yourselves, you fight it out in an election, and then after the election is over, you have to reorganize the country, and you have to find a union with your enemies. Well, they're your opponents. They're not your enemies, okay? And that's what we have to remember. And right now, some people are forgetting that.
No doubt. Questions from the audience? Anybody got any questions?
Go ahead.
Yes.
No, there's a microphone, so.
Thank you. No, so you spoke a little bit about, how we maybe misconceive Lincoln's journey from Prairie Dog to Pennsylvania Avenue. And I'm curious to know how you speak about that to your students, how you use that time and teach them that, it may not have been as quick as they thought.
Right, so it's key. Because Lincoln had a year of formal schooling. Every one of us, every one of my students is better educated than Abraham Lincoln, even the guys here who went to Princeton, okay? But how did he become this great figure? He read. He read the Bible. He read Shakespeare. He read the newspapers. He was a reader. Kids today don't read. They look. The phones are killing us.
They scroll.
They scroll. We have to get people to remember first principles. You got to read books. That's why I'm so glad you got books, even though they're mine, right? But the point is, the kids don't read books like they used to, and it's hurting them.
The national IQ is going down. And the big article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago about that. I forgot to point out that in our audience, my good friend Ray Washburn. Ray's great grandfather, Elihu Washburn, is mentioned 20 times in this book, who was one of Lincoln's
And there's
closest...
a picture of him.
Yeah, he was one of Lincoln's closest friends and was Grant's best friend. But anyway, so when you're hopefully reading the book, not just carrying it home, but reading it, and you keep seeing the mention of Elihu Washburn, that's Ray's great-great-grandfather. Other questions?
We have one over. Okay.
Who were Lincoln's mentors that brought him to such a strong belief in the abolition?
All right, that's a good question. Who were Lincoln's mentors? And, you know, in the book, I kind of de-emphasize mentors because I say he was so self-contained and so self-confident. But obviously, he had a lot of interaction with different people, you know, from early in his career. But if you're asking the question of who were his mentors as anti-slavery, you know, his law partner, his junior partner, William Herndon, claimed to educate Lincoln up on abolitionism. He was a radical anti-slavery man. Now, I don't think he deserves the credit he gives himself, but his books do. He had a lot of anti-slavery pamphlets and materials, and Lincoln read them. And some of what you hear in the Gettysburg Address is Lincoln paraphrasing from some of those pamphlets. Like the phrase, government of the people, by the people, for the people. That's not original to Lincoln. That comes to him by way of Daniel Webster and a famous abolitionist minister that Herndon had a sermon from. That phrase was from Theodore Parker, who was a leader in Boston. So he had a lot of influences. I wouldn't call them mentors, but a lot of influences.
Well, I think one of the most interesting new points in your book that I hadn't read before, we always hear about Henry Clay as, quote, Lincoln's great political hero. And yet your book says, well, sometimes he was, but sometimes he wasn't.
So like I keep saying, my book is kind of built with behind-the-scenes stuff. So when Lincoln delivered the eulogy on Clay, there's a scene from later in the Civil War where Lincoln and Seward, William Seward, as Secretary of State, were, you know, as my kids say, they were chopping it up about, you know, the days in the past. And Lincoln was saying, when I was preparing the Clay eulogy, I went to look to see if he ever gave a eulogy that I could model, and I couldn't find one. And Seward jumps in, and this is all recorded in another person's diary who was in the room with them, the room where it happened, right? Seward says that's because he was too selfish to ever give a eulogy for another man. And then they started talking about how selfish Clay was. Now, you could read a lot of Lincoln books, and you're not going to see that diary description of them complaining about Clay because it happened several years later, and it was in a private diary. But it's very revealing about what Lincoln thought about Clay. He admired him, but he also criticized him in private.
Yeah, I was in Lexington last fall and took a tour of Henry Clay's home, and every other sentence they're talking about how he was Abe Lincoln's great political hero. They're probably not going to stock your book in their gift shop.
Yeah.
Other questions? We got any other?
There was.
Yes.
What would a contemporary political observer in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s make of our current partisan environment?
Look, I think they would, you know, they would be comfortable with, look, they had a lot of political violence and a lot of political disagreements. They wouldn't be shocked by that. I mean, in a lot of ways, we're returning to the issues of the 19th century: tariffs, immigration, voter fraud. This is a room that'll appreciate this line. In 1858, Lincoln's running against Douglas in that campaign. He writes a letter to the chairman of the Republican Committee in Chicago, and this is how he opens the letter. It's a private letter. He says, I am confident that we will succeed. This is a Republican writing about the Democrats. He says, I am confident if we will succeed if we are not overrun by fraudulent votes to a greater extent than usual. You know, so like that Republicans complaining about Democratic voter fraud, and he was blaming it on immigrants. It was just, you know, some of the things would sound familiar, but I think they would still be disappointed, no doubt, that we're in the 250th year of the country, and everything's a fight, and people don't seem to be celebrating it as much as they should. They were intensely patriotic, even though they were partisan. We need to be partisan and patriotic, and I'm sure we are, but it feels like it's slipping away, and that's why we need to recommit to it.
Any other questions? Well, Matt, we're so glad you came to Dallas.
Thank you.
If you haven't gotten your book signed, Grasping Matt Pinsker's views on the partisan side of Abraham Lincoln was an eye-opener, and it made for a very lively conversation. Make sure you catch all my podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, the website of the Washington Independent Review of Books, and now the Dallas Morning News is publishing and promoting my podcast. Until next time, remember the words of my late great friend Bobby Bragan. You can't hit the ball with the bat on your shoulder. This is Talmage, Boston. Thanks for listening.